Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we're going to be talking about the best decks that counter the best decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket. I think that the format has really settled in. I think most people understand what the best decks in the game are, but what I've been kind of noticing, at least from the meta shares and sort of the data from all of the most recent competitions, is that some people don't necessarily know what counters what, at least at the highest of degree. So we're on Limitless.com, we're at the overall format meta page here where we have all of the data and all of the statistics that we need to take a look at all of the decks that, again, counter the best decks in the format. So right here, right now, we're taking a look at the top decks of this Space-Time Smackdown format over the last 4 weeks or so. This is where all of the data has been compiled. So yes, there's going to be some subjectivity here, but really we're talking about data and statistics. So if you disagree with anything in this video, I apologize. It's really just what the numbers show. These are the most played decks and really the most successful decks of the format. Of course, Exeggutor and Celebi number 1, Darkrai, Magnezone number 2, and then we have Charizard and Moltres at number 3, most played deck. However, it's only a 48% win rate. So again, not a necessarily super successful deck. Darkrai and Greninja here at number 4 with a 54% win rate. Gyarados and Greninja here at 49% in the fifth most played deck. Palkia and Vaporeon, 6th most played deck at 51%. Magnezone, Skarmory, 54%. And Weavile and Darkrai, 52%. Fighting Magnezone here at number 9 with 53%. And then Exeggutor with Mew EX and Yanmega both above 50% at 10 and 11 most played deck. If we go down here, these are the other decks that aren't necessarily what I would call like at the top of the metagame. We have things like, Pachirisu and Rampardos and Lucario, and then, which actually do have pretty high win rates in their own right, but 14th and 15th most played deck. And then if we go down here, we have, Infernape, Darkrai, Weezing, and, Bastion on Skarmory, kind of the off-meta or sort of rogue decks that aren't necessarily kind of the most played. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and focus around the top 5 or top 6 most played decks here, and then we're going to take a look at the decks that are the most strong against these top decks. So first and foremost, Exeggutor EX and Celebi, the number 1 deck of the format. What decks should we be playing to counter Exeggutor and Celebi? Well, let's go and take a look, shall we? So Exeggutor Celebi, again, 54.5% win rate, the number 1 most played deck here. A lot of matches here, a lot of data to take a look at. And let's take a look at its matchup spreads against the other most played decks of the format. You'll notice something pretty interesting here. Something that I've talked about time and time again is that Exeggutor and Celebi is by far just the best deck of the format. There really isn't a lot of decks that are direct counters to Exeggutor, as we can see here. Basically winning matchups against basically everything at the top of the format, whether that's Darkrai, Magnezone and Skarmory, Darkrai, EX and Greninja, and Palkia, Weavile, Darkrai, Magnezone, Hitmonlee, Pachirisu, literally everything, basically, other than really just 2 decks, I would say, that are kind of viable picks, and that's going to be Charizard and Moltres here at 31%. This is really the number 1 counter pick to Exeggutor. I think everybody kind of knows that. Let's quickly go ahead and let's take a look at Charizard so we have some deck lists at least to show you guys. And I do like Charizard, at least in the format. It always has a pretty low average win rate because, and really the reason for that is that Charizard isn't really good at beating any of the other most played decks in the format other than Exeggutor. It's kind of the only card or the only deck right now that has a really hard counter to Exeggutor. I think a big reason for that is not because we're fire type necessarily and because we're hitting Exeggutor for weakness. It really just comes down to the Crimson Storm attack from Charizard EX. Exeggutor is a deck that really loves hanging around for a long time and doing small bits of damage over and over and over again and putting a really hard control over a match. Not a lot of decks can compete with Exeggutor in that sense. However, Charizard does 200 damage. Yes, it takes a little bit while to set it up, but once Charizard gets set up, there's really not much Exeggutor can do other than get lucky with Celebi and flip 4 coins. However, if we get our Charizard set up quick enough, we should be able to just Crimson Storm turn after turn and just win the game. That's really what it comes down to. 200 damage is 200 damage. Exeggutor has 0 chance of living. This is the list that won last week's Ursa Days tournament. I do think that Charizard is a decent pick in the format purely from the perspective that it has a good Exeggutor matchup, but we'll take a look at it in a little bit. There's really nothing else or no other reason to be playing Charizard because it does not have a good overall win rate or matchup spread against the other decks in the format. But What other decks are strong against Exeggutor? Again, very, very slim pickings here. Not a lot of options. I think a lot of people would have assumed that Magnezone and Skarmory would have a winning matchup against Exeggutor, but as we see here, 53% win rate for Exeggutor in this matchup. To be fair, this deck does not beat Exeggutor whatsoever. I think in theory, that was the idea here, is that Skarmory with 50 damage was able to KO Exeggcutes in the active spot, but it just doesn't really matter that much. Exeggutor with giant capes, with having 2 Exeggcutes on that they can potentially put on their bench, or leading off with Celebi, it just doesn't result in being a favorable matchup against Skarmory. Technically, this is sort of an aggro deck, and Exeggutor really kind of eats up aggro decks. It's really like the #1 anti-aggro deck in the format. So yes, technically Skarmory with 50 damage can KO and Exeggcute, but really not a good matchup. By the way, I mean 53%. So this is literally a bad matchup. I would say a pretty decent winning matchup for Exeggutor. So we should not be playing Magnezone and Skarmory to counter Exeggutor. Yeah, nothing else really has any good matchup, I would say, against Exeggutor. Gyarados does have a 46%. Or Exeggutor has a 46% matchup against Gyarados, so that is somewhat substantial. Let's take a look at one of the most recent successful Gyarados decks, and it's not really changed at all. I do like Gyarados. Again, it has a decent Exeggutor matchup. I believe it has a good Charizard matchup, but overall, I think that Gyarados really does struggle in the sense that we don't love playing against a lot of the Hitmonlee and Magnezone decks that are really, really common in the format right now. It's got a similar issue to Charizard. I think it's like kind of this middling version of Charizard in terms of a meta pick, where Charizard definitely struggles against most decks of the format, but beats Exeggutor pretty heavily. Gyarados beats Exeggutor very slightly, however, it doesn't have as bad of a matchup spread against the other decks in the format, but definitely not a very dominant matchup spread against all of the other top decks in the format. So Gyarados is an interesting pick. However, a lot of people still choosing to play Gyarados, which I find very, very interesting, but no, the deck list hasn't really changed much. It's just that classic Druddigon Greninja combo with that massive Gyarados EX that we set up on the back line and hopefully sweep through our opponent. 140 is an awkward number, but plus Water Shuriken, plus Rough Skin, it usually is enough to take one-hit KOs. Gyarados still a very, very strong card right now, however, with the heavy Darkrai format, with the heavy Magnezone format, and a lot of Hitmonlee still seeing a decent amount of play, Gyarados really does have a few matchups that are really, really bad for it, technically, even though we have a slight winning matchup against Exeggutor. I don't think there's enough reason for us to play Gyarados. That's personally my opinion. And if we go down, literally nothing else can card counter Exeggutor beside Charizard unless we go all the way down and we take a look at Infernape and Moltres. Very, very similar. I think for similar reasons, Infernape and Moltres has a good matchup against Exeggutor for the same reasons that Charizard does, if I'm being entirely honest with you here. This is an interesting list. I just kind of picked the #1 most relevant Infernape deck, but yeah, not many people are playing Infernape. It really hasn't scratched the top 10 most played decks in the format, but I think for a similar reason. However, I would say that the weakness, the fire weakness on Exeggutor's part is actually relevant for Infernape EX. I think that doing 160 on an Exeggutor is kind of perfect there. You can one-hit KO it. It's a little bit more, I guess, consistent and early game focused than Charizard is. Yes, it's still a stage 2 Pokemon, but it requires only 2 energies to attack. That's a little bit easier to get behind than the 4 or 5 energies that Charizard takes, plus discarding the energy. So yeah, Infernape technically does have a good matchup against Exeggutor, about a 60% win rate, and that's pretty decent, I would say, but I don't think, again, similar to Charizard, that Infernape has a good enough matchup spread against really anything else in the format to really warrant seeing play. Now, this really kind of begs the question, like, this is why Exeggutor really is the #1 deck of the format. I've said it for a few weeks now. It just doesn't have enough counterplay. In fact, if we look at the counterplays, it's very much skewed in Exeggutor's favor. There really isn't a lot of options for us. If we're trying to specifically counter Exeggutor and Celebi, really all we have available to us is Charizard and Infernape, which in their own right aren't extremely good decks. And that's, I think, a big reason why Exeggutor has been so dominant and why it remains the #1 deck of the format. Like I said, Charizard, EX, and Moltres, only a 48% or 48.5% win rate overall in the format, which is quite low for the #1 counter to the #1 deck of the format. And if we go all the way down to Infernape, we see a 46% win rate as well. Very, very low. These decks are not necessarily super competitively viable. I think that Charizard does have the advantage if you are able to make it into top cut in this current format. odds are you're probably going to hit quite a bit of Exeggutors, so it's going to be tough to make it into day 2 for any of these larger tournaments if you're playing Charizard, but if you do make it into day 2, it's a very, very powerful deck, and technically you can beat anything in the format, which is an upside of Charizard. Not very fast-paced or consistent. The format's not very kind to Charizard, other than, of course, that Exeggutor matchup, but anyway, that's how we can counterplay Exeggutor. The options very, very limited. That's why I say week after week that Exeggutor is the #1 deck for the format, because it is, and the matchups really do tell us that. But next up, let's take a look at the Darkrai and Magnezone matchups, and we'll see what decks we can play to counter Darkrai and Magnezone, and what matchups this particular archetype struggles against. So, as we know, Exeggutor and Celebi is a good meta pick against Darkrai and Magnezone. Originally, kind of one of the reasons why Exeggutor really began to see a lot of play, and why it kind of was realized as one of the strongest decks in the format, because originally it was played kind of as a counter pick to these Darkrai decks. And the funny thing is that if we go all the way back, the reason why Magnezone and Darkrai originally saw a lot of success was because of all of the water decks that were dominant in the first week of play. So things are really kind of looping, at least into some degree, but I think things have settled in the sense that Exeggutor really just doesn't have a lot of, high quality counterplay. But Exeggutor, like we see here, 43% win rate, or rather a 56% win rate against Darkrai and Magnezone, which is quite good. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a super hard counter, but let's go ahead and take a look at Exeggutor and Celebi, which again, we've all seen this particular deck list here. There's a couple different ways we've seen a little bit less played versions of Exeggutor are still pretty good, whether that's with MeWe or Yanmega, but Exeggutor and Celebi, probably I would say the #1 reason why Darkrai Magnezone hasn't absolutely run away with this format. There's a couple other reasons for that. I just think that Exeggutor is overall a better deck if we took a look at its matchup spreads. Again, not many decks that can counter Exeggutor. However, Darkrai Magnezone, the #2 most played deck in the format, actually loses to the #1 most played deck in the format, which really does create this awkward skew in my mind. I really did expect Darkrai Magnezone to see less play as time went on, but unfortunately, it just didn't. Most people have just kind of stuck around and kept playing Darkrai Magnezone, even though it loses to the #1 most played deck in the format, but also loses to a couple really other interesting decks here. As we see, Darkrai and Greninja, very good matchup against Darkrai Magnezone. So about, what is this? Well, Darkrai Magnezone only has a 37% win rate against Darkrai and Greninja. Now, this is a deck that I was actually very, very high on early in this format. Or I guess after like the first or second weeks, I really thought that this would emerge as kind of the #1 option for Darkrai decks. I thought that it had a better matchup spread kind of overall in the format, and it actually had a better matchup against, or it had a winning matchup against the Darkrai Magnezone variant. So this is a very good counter to the Darkrai decks, but it also has very good matchups against other decks in the format. I really liked the Greninja Druddigon Darkrai combination. However, what ended up happening was people ended up just playing Exeggutor. This deck here doesn't have a great Exeggutor matchup. Similarly, how to the Darkrai and Magnezone deck doesn't have a great Exeggutor matchup. So it really comes down to, why would we play this version over the Magnezone version? Really, the only reason you would is because it has a good matchup against it. That's really the only difference. If you were deciding between, Darkrai and Greninja or Darkrai and Magnezone, if you wanted to win the matchups between those two, then yes, you would play Darkrai and Greninja. However, I think that Magnezone overall, being strong against Charizard, being strong against the other water decks, kind of has it a little bit more well-positioned. Exeggutor still the most played deck in the format, so we got to keep that in mind. But yes, Darkrai and Greninja is a very, very strong counter to Darkrai and Magnezone. As we see here, Darkrai Magnezone loses pretty significantly to Greninja. And if we go down here, the other deck I would say that really is the only other hard counter to Darkrai and Magnezone is going to be Fighting Magnezone. And the Fighting Magnezone deck, I made a video on this kind of not that long ago, because in my mind, I thought that this was one of the strongest anti-meta or counter-meta picks. Not trying to confuse anybody here, but I thought that this was really one of the strongest counter-meta picks in the entire game for a variety of different reasons. Not only does it have an exceptional matchup against Darkrai and Magnezone, but it also has a really good matchup against Gyarados and Charizard, decks that are still very, very commonly played. For some reason, this deck hasn't necessarily caught on. I think it has a very, very strong, like I said, win rates against some other really popular top decks in the format, against Darkrai Magnezone most predominantly, but also Charizard, which is kind of seeing the second or third most play in the format right now because of Exeggutor, which is really, really interesting if we really think about it. I think that we have to pivot in a way that makes a little bit more sense. I don't think that people necessarily play the decks that make the most sense every week. I think that as the format goes on, as it becomes more of a late game format, like I said, everything kind of settles down. And people really just play the decks that they want to play, especially knowing that there is a little bit of rock, paper, scissors going on. They don't necessarily counterplay the meta that specifically. However, like I said, this deck is a really, really strong counter pick. Unfortunately for this particular list, it struggles very much against Exeggutor. Another big problem with most decks in the format right now that otherwise would be really good. Unfortunately, they just lose to Exeggutor because Exeggutor and Celebi is the #1 deck in the game. I've been saying it time and time again. Even if it doesn't win this week, or it didn't win last week because Charizard won, it's still dominated, right? It got like 2nd place, 4th place, 7th, 8th. Exeggutor is by far the #1 deck in the format right now. We took a look at its counterplays, which is very, very limited. But yes, fighting Magnezone, I would say one of the most significant counterplays to Darkrai Magnezone, which again is still one of the most popular decks in the format. So Darkrai Magnezone, very, very strong, honestly. It has very high win rates against most decks, specifically the decks that aren't like meta decks. Like if you're playing sort of an off-meta deck and you run into Darkrai Magnezone, you're probably going to get rolled because it is a very, very strong deck, even though it isn't necessarily as well positioned as Exeggutor and Celebi. But let's go back now and let's take a look maybe at the next most played deck, which is Charizard EX. And I'm not going to spend too much time, I guess, on Charizard and Moltres because, well, you'll see why. The big reason why I'm probably not going to talk about how to counter Charizard and Moltres is because a lot of things beat Charizard and Moltres. In fact, almost every deck in the format beats Charizard and Moltres other than Exeggutor. So yeah, that's sort of one thing I'll note here is that, Charizard and Moltres really is just the counter pick of the format right now. It's really only seeing play to beat the Exeggutor decks, which are the #1 most played deck in the format. So it does kind of make sense, but Charizard and Moltres isn't necessarily something that we're trying to counterplay very much, because really it loses to almost everything, basically, as we see here, other than Exeggutor and Celebi, right? So we have a good matchup against Exeggutor and Celebi, almost 70%, and we have a good matchup against Exeggutor and Mew EX still. But other than that, 40% against Darkrai Magnezone, 40% against Darkrai Greninja, 26% against Magnezone and Skarmory. That's a very bad matchup for Charizard. Even only a 46% win rate against Palkia, 47% against Weavile, 22% against Fighting Magnezone. Very, very bad. Yeah, we beat Exeggutor and Yanmega as well. So that's really where Charizard is in the format. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about counterplays to Charizard because Charizard in its own right is a counterplay deck. It's not something that people are really trying to counter. However, to be fair, I mean, you got to keep in mind that if there were theoretically a deck that was both strong against Exeggutor and Charizard, it would probably emerge as the #1 deck of the format right now. Unfortunately, though, we just don't have a lot of great options. I do think that's kind of where Palkia and Vaporeon might kind of come in handy. You're going to kind of notice something here in this video, is that Palkia is by far the #1 most disrespected deck of the format. Let's get into that just a little bit, okay? Let's get into that just in a little bit later. Let's move off Charizard. And yes, we can talk about Darkrai and Greninja. This is we're dropping off pretty heavily in meta play here. None of the decks after, Exeggutor, Darkrai, and Magnezone and Charizard are what I consider, heavily played decks. As we see in the meta share here, we go from 11% to 8.5% to 8.5%, all the way down to 4%. So it's a very big drop off in the meta share, meaning how many people are playing these decks. So I wouldn't really expect people to necessarily care about countering these Darkrai Greninja, Gyarados Greninja, or Palkia or Vaporeon decks. However, let's quickly just take a look at the matchup spreads for Darkrai and Greninja, and we'll see kind of where some decks struggle or do well against this deck. A big reason, again, why I was really high on Darkrai and Greninja a little bit earlier on in this format was because, as we see here, 61% win rate against Darkrai Magnezone, 59% win rate against Charizard, 55% against Gyarados, about a 50% win rate against Hitmonlee, 50% against Palkia, 55% against Skarmory. Unfortunately for this deck, and 55 as well against Weavile. Unfortunately for Darkrai and Greninja, as we see here, very, very bad matchups against Exeggutor decks, whether that's the Celebi version or the Mew version, or if we go down as well, Dialga and Yanmega and Exeggutor and Yanmega. So Darkrai Greninja is basically good against everything other than Exeggutor/Grass decks, and this does kind of really showcase the big problem with this deck and really the format overall right now. I think that if Exeggutor hadn't emerged, I do think that this is overall actually the best version of Darkrai EX. In fact, it still has a very, very high win rate. Even beside the fact that we're losing to Exeggutors pretty handedly, 54% win rate is very respectable for losing to the top deck of the format. To me, it really shows that Darkrai and Greninja is exceptionally strong, but really the only hard counters to Darkrai and Greninja, similar to Darkrai Magnezone, are going to be the grass-type decks. The cool thing about Darkrai and Greninja is that we don't actually struggle with the fighting variant like the Darkrai Magnezone deck does struggle against, so that's pretty significant in its own right. But let's quickly take a look here. No, not here. I want to go back. We're going to go back to the normal one. So again, I'm not going to showcase any of those decks because again, I think it kind of does showcase what's strong against Darkrai and Greninja. Now let's quickly take a look at the Gyarados matchups and we'll see what decks are strong against Gyarados EX and Greninja. Again, not a deck that we're necessarily focused around counterplaying too much. I believe it's the 5th or 6th most played deck in the format. And there are specific very hard counters to Gyarados. In fact, the overall matchup spread for Gyarados is quite interesting, I would say. We have a very slightly decent matchup against Exeggutor. We lose very slightly against Magnezone. We beat Charizard pretty handily. We lose rather to Darkrai and Greninja pretty handedly. We lose to Palkia pretty handedly. We lose to Weavile pretty handedly, and we very much lose to Magnezone and Hitmonlee very handily. So it's kind of interesting, especially Skarmory as well. We also lose to Skarmory and Magnezone. So we really do struggle against most decks of the format if you're playing Gyarados, other than, like I said, maybe Exeggutor to a very slight degree. So why would we play Gyarados in the format? It's very interesting to me. I don't actually know. Yes, Gyarados did actually win the first Ursa Days tournament of this format, so maybe it's just sort of carrying that legacy on throughout the format. Gyarados and Greninja and Druddigon is still a strong combination, but as far as like its position in the metagame goes, similarly to Charizard, it doesn't necessarily do that well against most things other than just the Exeggutor decks. That's really the only, and Charizard, I guess, to some degree. Those are really the only reasons why we would play Gyarados. So I guess the Charizard matchup might help because Charizard's seeing a little bit more play as time goes on. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that there's a lot of big reason to counter Gyarados, but if we did want to counter Gyarados, we should be playing Fighting Magnezone for sure, or we should be playing Magnezone and Skarmory, or really any Magnezone deck for that matter. They all should have pretty good matchups against Gyarados, so keep that in mind as well. But lastly here, and this is really where I'm going to end the video, and what I want to talk about is the 6th most played deck of this format overall is going to be Palkia EX and Vaporeon, okay? So let's take a look at the matchup spreads for Palkia EX and Vaporeon here. We see that we struggle against Darkrai Magnezone, and we struggle very slightly against Exeggutor, but it's actually a pretty even matchup across the board. But we have a favorable matchup against Charizard. We have a favorable matchup against Darkrai and Greninja. Or sorry, Gyarados and Greninja. Slightly losing to Darkrai and Greninja as well, but beating Weavile, Darkrai, and then we lose, of course, to Fighting Mag and really sort of the aggro Magnezone decks. But if we look at the top of the format here, we see that Palkia EX and Vaporeon is actually a lot more competitive than you might think. Like I said, we don't necessarily lose that much to Exeggutor, and we do lose a little bit to Darkrai and Magnezone, but overall, against things like Charizard, against Gyarados, against some of the other Exeggutor decks, we do really well. Palkia EX and Vaporeon, I think, is by far the most disrespected deck of the format right now. If Magnezone wasn't so heavily played, I think that Palkia EX and Vaporeon really would have run away with this format, and it would have been a very, very solid contender right now. However, people have just remained playing Darkrai and Magnezone. So for that reason, I don't necessarily think that Palkia is still a great choice in the metagame right now, but I do think that it is a lot better than people give it credit for. I put Palkia in the S tier like week after week because it's just a very, very strong deck. For it to have a 51% win rate across this format with so much Magnezone seeing play, to me is extremely impressive and really showcases how strong Palkia EX and Vaporeon really, really is. But there you go, guys. I just wanted to make this video because I wanted to at least just showcase the best counterplay decks against the other best decks in the format right now. But the thing is that I don't actually think that the format or the way that people are playing the metagame right now in the format is actually really conducive to the actual statistics. Like I said, a lot of people still playing Magnezone and Skarmory. It has a good matchup spread across the board, but does not beat Exeggutor. Darkrai Magnezone, again, still very heavily played, but it does not beat Exeggutor and Celebi. And then Darkrai and Greninja, it does actually beat Darkrai Magnezone, but loses to Exeggutor and Celebi. So like I said, Exeggutor and Celebi, by far the best deck of the format right now, beats almost everything that we could possibly go up against other than Charizard EX and Moltres, which a lot of people are playing, but you got to keep in mind that Charizard and Moltres struggles against almost everything else at the top of the metagame, specifically the Magnezone decks and Magnezone and Darkrai. So I think as long as people are heavily investing into Charizard, Darkrai Magnezone does still make some sense to play, but overall, if we're not trying to play Charizard to counter Exeggutor, I don't really think there's any reason not to play Exeggutor in the format right now. That's just my opinion. By far, in my mind, the #1 deck of the format, but there are some really specific counter meta picks. Like I said, if we're going to focus around decks that are specifically counter meta picks, I would say that Fighting Magnezone is still one of the best counter decks of the format right now. Yanmega and Dialga actually has a very consistent matchup spread as well against other top decks in the format, and Darkrai and Greninja as well, a very, very slept-on counter meta pick. Magnezone and Skarmory isn't as much a counter meta pick as I thought it would be. It's just overall a strong deck in the format, so I think it does deserve to see play, as we see here, about a 54% win rate, but not counter really to any of the other top decks of the format, so we have to kind of keep that in mind. So yeah, we're going to wrap up the video there, guys. Hopefully this was somewhat informative to you guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I would love to hear your opinions down in the comment section below. What decks are you playing right now to counter the format? I think that the format has settled into a really interesting spot right now, but I think that it's settling in a way that doesn't, to me, necessarily make that much sense. But we'll have to see. Again, people are just going to play the decks that they want to play, and that's totally fine. But I think if we're kind of putting ourselves in the best position possible to win games, then I think that we're going to be in a pretty better spot overall. But anyway, guys, peace out. Have a good one. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Join the Discord. Link to the Limitless page will be down in the description below. I apologize. I didn't make videos the last few days. I was sick, but the new expansion is coming soon, so I'm really, really excited for that. We're going to ramp up for that, all of those new cards, which are going to be coming to the game really soon. Yeah, tomorrow is Meta Monday, so we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Ursa Days tournament this weekend. About 1,500 people were competing, so I'm really, really interested to get into it. But anyway, guys, peace out. Have a good one. Have a good Sunday. Hope you had a good weekend. We'll talk to you guys later. And yeah, bye.